Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Ashton of Exova. So would you like to ask Mr. Ashton to join us, please?
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Ashton. Good. Are you happy to carry on?
I am indeed, yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Ashton, I've got a number of questions that I'm going to deal with at the beginning now, which arise from matters covered yesterday or potentially with some of your colleagues when they've been giving evidence. And then I'm going to turn to the topic I flagged yesterday, which is the September 2014 emails about the cladding. So we'll do that. We'll do these corrections and questions first.
Okay.
So first of all, a correction. Yesterday, while we were discussing the role of Artelia or Apple Yards and the role they played on the project and whether they performed roles other than that of QS, I referred to them mistakenly as performing the role of project administrator as well. Right. That was at page 19 of the transcript. In fact, I should have said that they were employer's agent, not project administrator. Does that make more sense?
It does indeed,
Great.
yes.
I apologise. That was my slip of the tongue. I asked you some questions yesterday, just on another topic, about inclusive design. And do you remember we looked at some of the early sections of approved document B, which provide that fire safety measures incorporated within a building will need to take account of the needs of all people, including those with disabilities. Do you remember we looked at those
indeed,
provisions?
Yes, I remember that.
Now, just on that topic, is it right that you were on the BSI, the British Standards Institute Committee, which drafted Part 8 of BS 55888 1999, which was headed Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Part 8, Code of Practice for Means of Escape for Disabled People? Were you on that committee?
I was on the code drafting committee responsible for several parts of BS 5588. In fact, I was the chairman for a number of years. But Part 8 was dealt with by a subgroup of the same committee.
Was that FSH 14?
FSH 14 was the overseeing committee, if I can call it that.
Yeah.
FSH 14-1 was a subcommittee of that main committee.
I see. So you were involved in relation to that British standard?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Let's just bring it up so we can just see it for a moment. It's BSI 6018. There we go. So it's fire precautions in the design, construction and use of buildings, code of practice for means of escape for disabled people. And my question really is, in the light of your work on that committee, should you not have had in mind considerations for designing means of escape for the disabled when you worked on the Grenfell fire strategies, given what was in approved document B at the time?
Well, I think we went into it in some detail yesterday, but the building regulations, or at least the approved documents, do not require the same level of provision for disabled people in residential buildings as they do in commercial buildings.
Yeah.
Now, why they chose to do that, I don't know. In an ideal world, you would have a block of apartments or flats, they're all called apartments nowadays, where there were provisions for disabled people. I mean, they do make provision for what they call accessible flats. So there are people with disabilities in residential blocks. But as I say, to go back to the core business, in an ideal world, there would be a means of getting those disabled people out of that block. Normally, it would be done by using the lifts.
Yeah.
But there would have to be a management regime attached to that to ensure that that would work. Now, that isn't always present in apartment buildings.
Yeah.
And that's presumably why, and I can't say for certain, why the government, the responsible government department didn't say that you had to make provision for disabled people to escape.
Were you aware, though, that there were the changes in 2006 to approved document B, which brought in those inclusive design provisions that we looked at yesterday?
Oh yes, I'm aware that it is covered in approved document B as well as in the British standard that you've got displayed at the moment.
Yeah.
But the fact remains that you do not have to make provision for means of escape for disabled people in residential buildings. I'm not saying that's right,
Yeah.
but that's what it is at the moment.
But is it right, and I think this is what you said yesterday, that in the light of that, it simply wasn't considered in the context of the fire strategies for the Grenfell project?
Correct.
Yeah. Just moving on to another topic. Yesterday, in response to questions about Miss Cooney's observations about the overall refurbishment plans, and you remember we looked at her email, whether they're making a crap situation worse in terms of fire safety. Right. I asked you whether you had warned the TMO about this, and the answer you gave, this is at page 9 of the transcript, lines 4 to 12. You said, I think when I had the first meeting with the TMO, which was essentially a design team meeting, which they attended, I did make the point fairly forcefully that the proposals as drawn up by Studio E were not acceptable in terms of getting approval under the building regulations, and that therefore we needed to do some serious work to get to a situation where we could actually go forward to Kensington and Chelsea with a confident that a scheme would be approved.
Yes, I remember saying that, yeah.
Yesterday. And you couldn't give a precise date for that meeting, but you said it was the very first design team meeting that had the full design team there, including the TMO. Now, the first meeting that you attended with the TMO and the rest of the design team appears to be the project meeting number 8, held on the 6th of September 2012. I just want to pull up the minutes for that. This is ART 406770. So we looked at these notes yesterday. We can see that you were physically present at this meeting because your 4 lines up on the present list.
Right.
Do you think that it was at this meeting that you made the comments that you referred to, these forceful comments?
Possibly.
I see.
I mean, I know I did say at one meeting that we had some hard work to do to get the scheme into an approvable situation or condition.
Because the point I want to put to you is that there doesn't seem to be anything in the minutes of this, or these notes from this meeting, that record that. What we've got on page 2, if we can go to this, and again, we looked at this yesterday, under fire, do you see that there?
Yeah.
We've got this note that Exova need to understand the existing situation and whether LFB do test the system twice a year, and what was behind the proposed upgrade works to the smoke exhaust fire. The statutory position on the design needs to be established, as it's not possible for building control to insist on enhancements. And then draft fire strategy needs detailed interrogation, and a meeting was arranged with Studio E early next week to review. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And the action for that is noted to be Studio E and Exova. And so the question I want to put to you is whether you did actually say that in a meeting with the TMO present, because that seems to be being disputed.
In my experience, minutes don't always reflect exactly what was said at meetings, but I do recall saying to more than just an audience comprising Studio E that there were approval risks based on the current proposals. I even referred to the need possibly to provide sprinklers to the non-residential portions and so on. Now, if I haven't got the date of the meeting right or the precise meeting right, I apologise, but I did say that.
Okay, yeah. To what extent were you seeking to engage with the TMO on that issue and talking directly to the TMO about it, as distinct from Studio E?
I wasn't really thinking about the TMO specifically when I made those comments. I just made the comments to whoever was assembled at that meeting.
Yeah.
This was before we did the first design note.
Yeah.
So it was in advance of that. Now that may give some idea as to actually when that meeting took place.
Yeah. Would you agree that you were day to day dealing with Studio E as part of the design team and not the TMO in respect of the preparation of the fire safety strategies.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So, and just moving on to another topic, this is in relation to the existing fire safety strategy. You said yesterday that you thought it was a misunderstanding between you and between Claire Barker and Kate Cooney, on the other hand, about who was actually going to finalise the draft existing fire strategy. You remember saying that?
I do, yes.
Now, given that this work remained outstanding for such a long period of time, from August 2012 until the end of Exova's involvement in the Grenfell project, I want to put to you, can that really have been a misunderstanding? Why was that not picked up in that length of time?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I assumed, as I said yesterday, that Claire was going to continue to deal with that until it was completed. But I did take from the recommendations of that draft report the issues that we needed to address with the refurbishment scheme.
Do you think it was that you simply forgot to come back and address that? Or in fact, did you actually think about it but consider finalising that draft report not to be a significant priority?
In the greater scheme of things, finishing that report off wasn't the top priority. I mean, we've got three strands here. We've got the risk assessment, which is carried out or should be carried out periodically, which will highlight things that have gone wrong or need to be put right. We've got work going on with the refurbishment, which was my main focus, and we have the existing fire safety strategy drawn up, which I took to be just a record of what was there, and I only took out of that draft the things that we needed to concentrate on going forward.
So can we take it from that answer that you were aware and conscious that it was a draft that hadn't been finalised, but you just didn't think that that was a priority that needed to be come back to?
If I'm honest, I didn't think it was that important, given that there were these other strands to the building.
Were you aware that the existing fire safety strategy was meant to be a baseline on which the refurbishment strategy built?
No.
And did you ever, in the next 4 years after 2012, investigate what had happened to the draft existing fire strategy?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so moving on to another topic. You said yesterday on a number of occasions that your time was stretched because you were handling often a large number of projects. Can you recall, to the best of your ability, approximately how many projects would you have been working on at any one time, say during 2012 when you were first working on the fire strategies?
Well, it could be 6 to 10, I guess, but they would all be at different stages of development. And I don't think that I want to give the impression that there wasn't enough time to deal with this project, because there was. Okay. I made enough time to do that.
Yeah. Now, another point arises from Miss Cooney's evidence. She was asked about why she hadn't referred to diagram 52 of approved document B in relation to the fire main outlets being in the lobbies. So, you know, at Grenfell Tower, the riser, the fire main outlets are in the lobbies. And she was asked a question, why did you not include any discussion or assessment within your draft existing fire strategy report about the impact on operation of firefighting of the fact that the main rise outlets were in the lobbies and not in the stair as required by diagram 52. Right. And the answer she gave was the outlets being in the lobby, and I'm fairly sure on this, were a requirement of section 20 of the London Building Acts at the time. Terry is probably your man to clarify this for you, is what she said.
Right.
So I just want to ask you, in your view, is it correct that it was a requirement of section 20 of the London Building Acts that the fire main outlets should be in the lobbies as opposed to in the stair?
That's totally correct.
And would you agree that the existing fire safety strategy should have addressed the impact on firefighting of not having the fire main outlets in the stair as required by the the current design guidance?
No, it sort of comes back to what I said at some point yesterday, that this was an existing building and it would not be reasonable, just because a more recent code of practice suggested some other way of dealing with things, that we should modify the building in the way you're suggesting.
And you don't think that that's something that could have been highlighted or should have been highlighted in the existing strategy and then addressed and explained why that was nevertheless not a difficulty in this building?
I don't think it should have been mentioned in her strategy, but I would like to say that this idea that the fire main outlet should be in the stair there wasn't unanimity amongst this in the fire community, if I can use that word, because what it meant was, in operational terms, that if a fireman was fighting a fire in a flat, the door to the stair would be permanently open.
Right, yeah.
And a lot of people in the BSI, for example, didn't feel that that was a good idea.
Yeah.
So to change that, given that it would be an unreasonable thing to ask for in an existing situation, didn't make a lot of sense technically.
Yeah, I see.
Well, I think the thrust of the question, and it applies, I think, to other things as well, is whether the fire safety strategy ought to identify changes in requirements since the date of construction of the building. In other words, to point out, well, it should be, it was supposed to be like this, but it's now supposed to be like that, and to highlight the distinction.
Yeah, we could have put in a general narrative, and perhaps we should have done, saying this building was built in 1971 to a code of practice which was drawn up in 1950 or wherever. It must be recognised that the arrangements there don't meet current standards. And taking a lesson from that, I think if we came to do a similar development or partial redevelopment, we would put that in as an upfront statement.
Yeah, thank you. Can we look now, staying with Ms Cooney for a minute, can we go to EXO 50388? So this is an email we looked at yesterday from Ms Cooney to you on the 10th of September 2012. And she says it in the very beginning, as promised, my thoughts on the possible solution to Grenfell Tower, general fire line markup attached to clarify ideas below. And then she set out various ideas under different headings. And we looked a lot yesterday at, if we can scroll down to the end of this email, this is the one where she talks about, in the third from bottom paragraph, some fairly long protected entrance halls. We talked about that. And then where she says in the next paragraph, the existing ventilation system is questionable and the overall scheme theoretically makes the existing conditions worse, etc. Just in terms of this email and how it came about, did Ms Cooney send you her thoughts on the possible solutions to Grenfell Tower because you asked her to do so?
No, the opposite. I think she went further than I thought she would. But I mean, all information is useful in pulling together a fire strategy for a building. So it wasn't unwelcome in that sense, but I didn't ask for it.
And the follow-up question is, if she was sending you thoughts on the refurbishment fire strategy, did that not prompt you to think, well, I need her thoughts on how to finalise the existing fire safety strategy?
It didn't lead me to think that.
Did you ever ask Miss Cooney any questions about the draft existing fire safety strategy?
No.
Did you ever discuss it with her at all?
No, I didn't. I mean, I think that she enlarged on the concerns that she had about the three issues that we've talked about in this document.
Yeah.
So I had a summary of what her views were about the building in one page.
So does that explain why you didn't feel the need to discuss it with her?
Yes, indeed.
On another topic, I take it that you are familiar with Article 13 of the RRO 2005, which relates to the obligation on the responsible person to ensure that the premises are equipped with appropriate firefighting equipment, fire detectors and alarms.
I am aware of that, yes.
I want to ask, what information did you seek from the responsible person, i.e. records, past compliance notes, in order to complete the outlined fire safety strategy?
In generally speaking, fire appliances for use by the occupants are not provided in residential buildings, because you can't train residents of flats to tackle a fire, and indeed it might be dangerous for them to do so. So, broadly speaking, there are no fire extinguishers in apartment buildings.
I appreciate that, but there'd be some equipment within the building which would be there for the purpose of firefighting, wouldn't there? I mean, the dry
Yeah,
rising
but those
main.
would be for use by the fire service. Now, in terms of the other parts of the building, I would have expected that there would be portable fire extinguishers for use by the occupants.
But is it right? My question is, did you seek any information at any stage from the responsible person in terms of records relevant to Article 13 of the RRO?
No, because it wouldn't have had any impact on the fire strategy report that I was working on.
Yeah. Did you ever have any communication with the responsible person?
No.
So moving on, yesterday we discussed the email you received from Janice Ray, or you were forwarded an email from Janice Ray, which, if you remember, had referred to the smoke control system not operating properly in a previous fire in the building in 2010. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
And I asked you why that hadn't caused you to update your fire strategy, to note that there'd been a
You mean the
fire.
existing building fire strategy?
No, the outline, the refurbishment strategy.
Well, I think you might ask the question, if there was a fire in 2010 and there was a criticism made about the smoke extract system, that something would have been done about it by the responsible person then. Now, in terms of mentioning it in the fire strategy that I drew up, no, we made a clear statement in there that we were going to improve it.
Were you aware, did anyone ever make you aware that during the fire in 2010, the AOV system sent smoke from the 6th and then later the 9th floor to upper floor lobbies to the 15th and 18th floor during that fire?
No. I'd seen no documentation about that fire.
Did you ever
the fact that there was an email which said there was a fire.
Did you ever ask for any documentation relating to that fire?
It wasn't really relevant to what I was doing.
Maybe I should have put to you that, well, it would certainly be relevant to the existing fire safety strategy, wouldn't it?
Yes, but I wasn't dealing with the existing fire safety strategy.
I see.
I mean, if you have a fire incident in a building like that, and there are things that you mention, like smoke spread from floor to floor via the automatic opening vents, then you would have expected the fire authority to have followed that up with the building owner or the responsible person. That doesn't seem to have taken place.
No, but that wasn't something that you thought to outline in your fire safety strategy to make sure that it had been followed up, given there are residents in that building, or were residents in that building at the time and were going to be for several years before the system was refurbished?
I didn't know that it had happened.
No. Well, you knew there'd been a fire in 2010. I think we established that yesterday.
Yeah.
You were sent that email. But is it right that you never requested any further details of what had happened in that fire or how serious?
No, because it wasn't my responsibility to do that. That would have been a matter between the fire authority and the responsible person.
Had you known that the malfunctioning of that system had been sending smoke from lower floors to upper floors, would that have rendered the stay-put strategy untenable and meant that mitigation ought to have been put in place in terms of evacuation?
We couldn't have, in the first place, I didn't know about it. In the second place, I don't think you can alter a stay-put strategy just like that, because you need to do a number of things to make sure that that can function. For example, you would need to put in a fire alarm system to ensure that people would respond and make their escape.
I appreciate there might be steps that would follow from that if it was considered that actually the stay put strategy wasn't tenable anymore. But wasn't it your responsibility to be flagging up that someone ought to be thinking about that?
No, I don't believe it was. I believe that should have happened at the time, not 2 or 3 years later.
Okay. Just one final topic before we then pick up where we left off yesterday. We looked at a document, I want to just bring it up, EXO 50693, which was an email of the 18th of September 2013. So if we scroll down within this document, I think it's on page 4 or 5 of this. That's it, yeah. So I showed this to you yesterday, and I asked you whether the reference in blue and underline meant that you were using a file share link to send documents back to Studio E. Now, it's been quite properly pointed out overnight that actually there's another version of this email. If we can look at that, that's EXO 50390. And if we look at the top of that, this is exactly the same email. It's another Exova reference. And I think I may have actually taken you to this later yesterday, but what we didn't pick up was that on the line attachments at the top, it looks like what you were sending back was actually 3 PDFs, Grenfell GL PDF, Metzanine PDF. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
So it does in fact appear that you were sending documents back attached to the email as PDFs rather than using a file share link in that occasion.
I wouldn't know how to use a file share link even now. I mean, the standard way that I dealt with these was to print the drawings, annotate them, scan them, and then send them back as PDFs.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, that might seem fairly simple, but it's fairly foolproof.
No, I understand. Yeah. Okay, so let's pick up then, and we're moving forward in the chronology to September 2014. And I want to look at an exchange of emails which you had on that date concerning the external cladding at the tower. Can we go to SEA 3011705? So if we can start with the top email on this page, this is Mr. Crawford of Studio E to you, copying in 2 Ryden personnel there, Simon Lawrence and Simon O'Connor. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
Subject, Grenfell Tower cavity fire barriers.
Yeah.
And he says, "Hi Terry, I'm working on the Grenfell Tower regeneration project from the Studio E end. The following RFI has come in relating to horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas. Can you comment on the RFI attached and whether you believe this interpretation in relation to stack effect is correct? Regards, Neil." Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
And is it right that RFI stands for request for information?
It does.
That's how you understood it?
Yeah.
So if we can go to that request for information, this appears at HAR 403616. So we can see, if we blow up the top half of this document. So this is, we can see at the top, it's to Simon Lawrence of Ryden from Daniel Anketel-Jones of Harley. It's dated the 17th of September 2014. And then we see lower down the query, "Please may you confirm the required extent of the horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas."
Right.
And can you see there's a suggested solution. "We believe that they will be required at every floor level on the vertical columns, but not in the area of cladding between windows. This is because there is no chimney effect here, and therefore the cladding will not add to the spread of fire." Do you see that? So that's the RFI that you've been forwarded by Mr. Crawford.
Yeah.
And then if we can go to your reply, this is at RYD 18154. And if we can go, I want to start on page 2 of this email string with your initial reply. Yeah, so if we can look in the second half of that page. Yeah. So this is an email you sent back at 11:33 on the 18th of September, and you reply, Neil, I've never seen details of what you're doing to the external walls. Do you have any cross-sections, elevations? Kind regards, Terry. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
Now, is it right that up until this point, you had given no substantive consideration whatsoever to the cladding or the impact of the cladding on external fire spread?
Correct.
Can you explain how it came about that despite preparing 3 issues of the fire strategy, you still didn't have the details of what they were doing with the external walls until this point?
Well, I think we went through this in some detail yesterday. I mean, they never sent me anything asking me to comment on it.
When you got this request from Mr. Crawford to look at this RFI, did this not ring alarm bells for you, given what you'd written in your previous fire strategies about the B4 requirement being satisfied by the proposals?
It didn't ring alarm bells because I'd never seen any details of what they were proposing, and that's what I said in my response.
Did you look back at what you'd written in your fire strategies? I mean, this is September 14, so it's nearly, it's not quite a year, but from your 3rd issue, which was November 2013, so it's quite a few months.
No, I didn't refer back. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that at September 2014, my belief was that we were not really a fully paid up member of the design team because Ryden were appointed in March. And we were never approached by Ryden to work for them.
I see.
And we did talk yesterday about why it was that we saw fit to respond to these emails, and we did it because we normally do that if it's limited in extent.
Yeah. And I
even though we consider ourselves not to be working on the project.
And I think what we established is what we don't see in these emails is you saying to Mr. Crawford, well, why are you asking me? We're not engaged anymore. If you want our advice.
Yeah, well, I did hint at that yesterday. I did say that we would have been entitled to say we are no longer employed on this project. Why are you asking me those questions? But I didn't see fit to do that.
Yeah. Now,
that wasn't entirely because we felt generous towards them, but, you know, if you refuse to help people when they ask you questions, it might be seen that you're not being very professional.
Yeah. Now, in fact, your reply, I've never seen details of what you're doing to the external walls, that may be that you'd not seen them, but as we established yesterday, you had in fact been sent details.
Not direct.
Well, there was
we
the
were sent a link to
the Stage C report.
Stage C report.
Yeah. And you had attended meetings in which cladding had been discussed, including zinc rain screen cladding.
No, I don't remember, as I said earlier, I don't remember cladding ever being discussed at meetings that I attended.
Now, Neil Crawford replies to you on the 18th of September, the same day, at 12:18. Can we go to that? I've got a different reference for that. Let's go to the different reference. I think I'm going to follow my notes here. So EXO 50709. Yeah. So this is Mr. Crawford's response at 12:18. So he says, "Hi Terry, please see attached our sections and the initial drawings set we have had from Harley's. The initial drawings from Harley's are fairly limited, but they attempt to establish the basic approach." And can you see there? Yeah, because the reason I've gone to this email is you can see that there's various attachments clearly that are sent with that email. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
And one of those is a drawing called SEA 127906120, the first one. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, if we can look at what you say at paragraph 5.17 of your witness statement, this is at EXO 401621 at page 15. In that last sentence, when you're dealing with this email, you say these were large-scale drawings which showed zinc outer cladding but did not specify the materials to be used for insulation. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, I just want to look at that drawing. If we can go to it and we will need the native version. This is EXO 50710. Yeah, if we can, what I want to do is look at the labels on the left-hand side of those sections. Perhaps we can look at the top of the page and zoom in. Now they're quite small, Mr. Ashton, but that's better, thank you. So can you see that we get various labels here, and we can see that at the top there it says H92 zinc composite rain screen panel. Do you see that? And framing system to sills. Can you read that?
I can, yes.
And then if we keep going down, we should see one that's labelled H92 776. Stop there. Sorry, keep going down a bit further. Yes, there are 3 labels up from the bottom. There's a H92 776 thermal insulation. Do you see that?
I do.
Yeah. Now, did you understand when you got these drawings what these little labels in circles were referring to?
Well, I assumed that there were various components of the cladding system.
Yeah. So, I mean, had you seen similar references like H92 in other projects or P10?
No, that... It didn't mean anything.
Didn't mean anything to you. So you didn't understand that related to the employer's requirements and the NBS specification for the project?
No. And may I say, I didn't look at these drawings in any great detail. I just noted that the outer material seemed to be zinc, and that the insulation wasn't defined at that stage.
I see. So you noted that much?
Oh, yes.
Why didn't you look at the drawings in any great detail?
Because, as I said earlier, we were no longer part of the design team. We hadn't been employed by Ryden. And so I wasn't spending a lot of time on this.
Did you ever make that clear to Studio E?
No.
No, you didn't ever say, by the way, I'm not spending much time on this. You need to understand that.
No, I didn't make that clear to them, no. But as an overall impression, we have a building which is going to be clad with zinc, with some aluminium elements, such as window flashings. And there was some insulation, which I would expect to see, but it wasn't specified as whatever it was. It was just insulation. But
you didn't think to ask for more details?
No. I think it comes back to the fact that I wasn't employed by Ryden, and therefore I didn't feel that I was obliged to spend a lot of time on this.
Just to be clear, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I want to just check with you. Did you ever see any employer's requirements or the NBS specification at any stage on the Grenfell project?
No, I mean, that's an interesting question, because employers' requirements are normally provided at the beginning of a development, not towards the end. Because if you're drawing up a fire strategy for a building, you need to know what the employer's requirements are, and I never saw them on this job.
And did you ever ask to see the employer's requirements?
No. And had I done so at the time that I produced the first report, they wouldn't have been available, it would appear.
Now, just to be clear, when you looked at these drawings sent to you, was this the first time that you'd looked at Studio E's design and specification for the cladding system?
Well, I was given to understand these were Harley drawings, not Studio E drawings. Yeah, and it was the first time, yes.
Yeah. Can we then turn to your reply to the email you were sent then by Mr. Crawford? If we can go EXO 50708. So it's on the same day. Yeah, and if we can zoom in to the top box. So this is at 1532. You say, Neil, if the insulation in the cavities behind the rain screen cladding is combustible, you will need to provide cavity barriers. cavity barrier as shown on your drawing, number 127906120. That's the one we were just looking at.
Indeed.
In order to prevent fire from spreading from one flat to the one above, even if there isn't a continuous cavity from the top to the bottom of the building. Kind regards, Terry. You see that?
I do.
Yeah. Now, I just want to take this response in stages. First of all, what do you mean by if the insulation in the cavities behind the rain screen is combustible?
Well, as I said yesterday, there were systems around which employed combustible insulation, but which had been validated for use by test the BS 8414 and therefore satisfied BR 135. So, and there must be a number of buildings in the country which still have combustible cladding which is endorsed in that way by test evidence.
You've said there if the insulation in the cavities is combustible. Did you think to ask for the specification for the insulation to check that point?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
I wanted to deal with this in a light way because I wasn't working on the project full time.
I see. What was the reaction to fire performance requirement for insulation in approved document B for buildings over 18 metres at this time?
Well, if you were going the linear route, as Studio E described it, which is a term I don't understand, you would have to use materials of limited combustibility. However, if you were using a tested system, you wouldn't have to do that.
Yes, so under paragraph 12.7 of ADB, the insulation should be of limited combustibility in a building greater than 18 metres.
Yeah.
What did you understand the term limited combustibility to mean at the time?
Well, it's a term that's defined in approved document B. And broadly speaking, historically it was introduced so that plasterboard wasn't deemed to be a combustible material, bearing in mind that plasterboard has a non-combustible core but is faced both sides with paper or cardboard. And so it was an artificial definition produced by the DOE at the time.
And that
now, sorry.
No,
Please go on.
No, you finish your answer.
Well, I pretty well have. Yes, I have. Thank you.
And is it right that that definition was by reference to certain fire testing?
It included materials which have been tested to various parts of the British standard. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Now, if you were aware that under paragraph 12.7 the insulation should be of limited combustibility, then why were you asking whether the insulation was combustible?
I wasn't asking whether, I was saying if it was combustible, you would need to provide cavity barriers.
Can you explain why you didn't immediately draw Mr. Crawford's attention to the fact that the insulation must be of limited combustibility if following ADB paragraph 12.7?
I didn't know which route they were taking.
Why didn't you ask?
Because, as I said earlier, I didn't feel obliged to do a lot of work on this, given that we were not part of the design team.
Would you agree, looking at this now, this email, that it appears to suggest that combustible insulation is permissible as long as there are cavity barriers?
It could be interpreted that way, yes, I agree.
Is that how you meant the email to be read?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I didn't know what insulation they were using. I didn't know whether they were going compliance with ADB or whether they were going to use a system which had been tested.
But given you didn't know, it wasn't the correct advice to give, was it? To say, or to suggest that if the insulation is combustible, it's permissible as long as there are cavity barriers.
I could have worded it better, I concede that.
Do you agree that as at the 18th of September, you'd not been provided with any information suggesting that the proposed cladding system that Studio E or Harley were proposing to use had been tested to BS 8414 or otherwise shown to meet the performance criteria in BR 135?
I hadn't been given any information. at all about the cladding, or the insulation for that matter.
Did it not occur to you at this point to advise Studio E about the risks of using combustible insulation in a cladding facade?
I didn't feel that that was my job at this stage of the project.
And I mean, I just want you to think about the warning that is in approved document B at 12.5, that the use of combustible materials in the cladding system may present a risk to health and safety. Did you not think, with reference to that very clear warning, that you ought to be giving that warning to the design team on this project?
No, I think I think it comes back to what I was saying yesterday, which is that because of the very onerous requirements of the thermal regulations, designers are forced to use more thermally efficient insulation. And at that time, there was a lot of work going on at making highly efficient plastic type materials compliant in order to minimise the amount of insulation provided on the external walls of buildings. If you're restricted to using mineral wool, which is effectively the only alternative, the thickness of your external wall would be quite significant. That's why there was a lot of work going on at seeing if other materials had better thermal properties than mineral wool could be used.
Yeah.
And they were having it tested on a regular basis.
Do you agree, looking at this now, that you ought to have ensured that the design team was fully and properly advised as to the risks of using combustible insulation in the system and the requirements in approved document B, or the guidance in approved document B, in particular at 12.5 and 12.7?
No, I think that the designers should have been aware themselves of the need to comply with the building regulations and the guidance documents that they are published in support of those regulations. If this issue had come up at a time when I was a fully paid up member of the design team, then all of these things would have been discussed in much more detail.
Yeah.
I'm being asked to comment on things when we've effectively left the design team and only in little bites of information, not the full picture.
Did you appreciate at the time that that was quite a risky thing to be doing, to be advising piecemeal without full details on something as important as an external wall, given the effect it could have on compartmentation?
Arguably, it's a risky thing for the architect to do as well.
But I'm asking you whether you appreciated at the time.
Asking me something, a question which is not supported by a sufficient level of detail.
Now, just going back to the answer that you've given there, you've recognised that combustible insulation would permit the spread of flame upwards from one flat to another. Do you see that there?
Yes, yes.
Can you explain why you've suggested that the need for cavity barriers depends on there being combustible insulation?
I'm not quite sure I'm saying that. Cavity barriers are required irrespective of the combustibility or otherwise of the insulation. The regulations are quite clear. You have to provide cavity barriers at the junction of all compartment walls and compartment floors with the external walls.
Yes, quite. But can you see, reading this now, where you said if the insulation in the cavities behind the rain skin is combustible, you will need to provide cavity barrier as shown on your drawing. Do you see that? Can you see that it seems to make it contingent, the cavity barriers, on there being combustible insulation?
Well, if it's read that way, then it wasn't meant to read that way. And I concede that it could have been more clearly worded.
Yeah. And it's right, isn't it, that approved document B recommended that cavity barriers were provided around the windows and also at the head of the cladding system, regardless of whether the insulation was combustible?
That was the requirement or recommendation in the approved document. Yes, I agree.
So even if the insulation was of limited combustibility, isn't it right that cavity barriers were still required to be provided if following that guidance?
If you followed that guidance to the letter, yes, that's correct.
At this time, were you aware of paragraph 12.8 of approved document B, which required cavity barriers to be installed in accordance with Section 9 of approved document B?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And were you aware that to comply with Section 9, and in particular diagram 33, cavity barriers are required around all openings in the external walls, i.e. around all window openings, at the head and top of the external wall, and at the junction of compartment walls and floors?
Yes, I was aware.
And those cavity barriers are all required, just to be clear, irrespective of the reaction to fire performance of the insulation. Do you agree?
I do agree.
Given that, why do you not recommend cavity barriers at the window openings or at the top of the external walls?
That wasn't the question I was being asked, I don't think.
Can we just go back to the drawing that you looked at? And you appear to have looked at it, because in the email you say you need to provide cavity barrier as shown on your drawing. So it does appear that you looked at this drawing at the time.
Very briefly, yes.
Can we go back to that drawing, then the native version? That's EXO 50710. And I want to zoom in on that top section again as much as we can. Now, the point I want to put to you is that the horizontal cavity barriers in this drawing are not placed around the window frames, but only in between the windows. So in this section, for example, there's nothing shown at sill level, is there? Can we see that at the bottom of the page? There's no cavity barrier.
Maybe the drawing needs to go up a bit so I can see the bottom. There is a cavity barrier which is in the same horizontal plane as the floor.
Yes.
Yeah.
But can you see the window frame above that? There's no cavity barrier, and there's no label for a cavity barrier at the sill of the window, at the bottom of the window.
I can see that now, yes, but as I said to you earlier, I didn't look at this drawing in any great detail.
So when you were advising that you would need to provide the cavity barriers as shown in this drawing, were you just talking about the cavity barrier you can see, and you didn't think about whether or not other cavity barriers ought to be there as well?
That's right.
And again, can you explain why you advised in that way?
I can't really add to what I said earlier, which is that I didn't give these drawings much attention. I just wanted to know in broad terms what they were doing. I wasn't asking for full constructional details in order for me to do hours and hours of work for which I was not entitled to be paid for.
Were you aware of the importance of cavity barriers around the windows?
Yes.
In terms of preventing fire spread from the compartment into the cavity and then into the system?
Yeah, we did have a little bit of a discussion about this yesterday. You definitely need cavity barriers at the junction of walls and compartment floors. There is some debate about the efficacy of cavity barriers around window openings where you've got cavity barriers on all four sides. However, I concede that is not what the approved document says.
No, diagram 33 is very clear, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why didn't you give detailed advice to Mr. Crawford as to the required location of cavity barriers in accordance with the requirements of approved document B?
I'm sorry if this is going to sound repetitive. We weren't really charged with helping them in this way. We weren't employed by Ryden.
And does it follow that you didn't think it was part of your role when you were responding to this email to be stating that the drawings did not comply with approved document B because they didn't have cavity barriers at the window openings?
No, I didn't see that to be my function at all.
And these drawings don't show cavity barriers at the top of the external wall either. We zoom out. We see the top on the right-hand side of this drawing. We were looking at the left.
Right.
And there's no cavity barrier at the top of the building. Do you see that?
There's not one that's labelled, but there's one looking at it now which could be
There's one at the top of
Thought
that
of the
window,
cavity
but
barrier.
I'm talking higher
Yeah.
up. Shouldn't there
Well,
have been one higher up at the very head of the cladding
I
system?
can't answer that now. I mean, if I'd been asked to look at these in detail sometime earlier in the design procedure, then I would have gone over them with a fine-tooth comb.
Okay. Now, later that same day, so staying with the 18th of September 2014, Neil Crawford sent you another email. Can we go to that? SEA 30011724. And I want to look at the top of page 1. Yes, thank you. So just looking at that very first email at the top. So this is now at 4:07 in the afternoon. And then he says, Terry, is this interpretation correct? See below. Regards, Neil. And then if we can look at the email directly below, it's from Daniel Anketel-Jones to Mr. Crawford, copying in Ryden and Kevin Lamb as well.
Right.
Subject, Grenfell Tower cavity fire barriers. And it says, Neil, thank you for your response. And he says, the insulation is class 0. Therefore, after reading the correspondence below, I believe that the fire barrier in these locations will not be necessary. Can you confirm that this is acceptable? So this is a debate that's going on within the design team about whether further fire barrier is necessary. And he said there the insulation is class 0. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do.
Now, we can also see from the top email, when Neil Crawford emails you forwarding this on, he attaches a rain screen cladding product datasheet, August 2014 PDF. Do you see that there?
I see there is attachment, yes.
Yeah. And I want to just go to that attachment. This is at RYD 30018155. This is, if we zoom into the top half of this, this is the Celotex RS5000. Sorry, in the very top right-hand corner, there is actually a date, which I can't now see on the screen. Yeah, issue 1,
Yeah.
August 2014. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
So this is the Celotex RS5000 datasheet for premium rain screen cladding board. And it says there, it's our premium performance PIR solution for use in rain screen cladding systems. Now, I'm going to come back and ask you some questions about this data sheet. But before I do, I just want to follow through what happened with the emails before I ask you a number of questions. I want to go to your response to Mr. Crawford's email,
Right.
where he asked for advice on Mr. Anketel-Jones's interpretation. And if we can go to that, EXO 401430. And if we can go zoom in at that, thank you. So this is 16:21, so a little bit later in the afternoon. You respond to Mr. Crawford, Neil. A material which has a class 0 rating is not necessarily non-combustible, although the reverse is invariably true. Some class 0 products will burn when exposed to a fully developed fire. In any case, you need to prevent fire spread from, I think you mean one flat.
I think I meant one, yeah.
Yeah, to the flat above, as I stated in my earlier email. What isn't clear from the information to hand is whether or not there's a continuous cavity from top to bottom in any part of the cladding, apart from around the column casings, irrespective of the type of insulation. Kind regards, Terry.
Right.
You see that? Now, again, I want to ask you a number of questions about this exchange. First of all, do you recall reading the data sheet for the insulation which Mr. Crawford had forwarded to you?
No, I didn't open the attachment.
Do you
Why
know-
would I? I mean, I didn't see the need to open the attachment.
Why
Just,
not?
well, I'm just dealing with an exchange of emails about whether a Class O material means you don't need to have cavity barriers.
But wouldn't it be important to open the attachment, look at the data sheet, so you can see exactly what type of insulation it is?
This is down to communication. I assumed that if I needed to look at it, that Neil would have said, please see the attached and the data sheet attached. He didn't. He just asked me a question about whether whether you needed cavity barriers because of the fire performance of the material.
Well, he's asked you about whether Mr. Anketel-Jones's interpretation is correct. He says the insulation is class 0, and they've forwarded to you the data sheet, so you've got the information on the insulation. Wasn't it patently clear that you needed to open that attachment and then
No,
respond?
it wasn't. It wasn't clear to me that that was what I needed to do.
Were you familiar with the Celotex RS5000 product at this time? So this is September 14. It was actually launched in August 14, as per the data sheet. So it was only launched a month before, but were you aware of the Celotex RS5000 product?
I was aware that there was a product called Celotex. I've not actually investigated it or not had cause to investigate it for any particular application.
How long had you been aware? Because we know there'd been another product called FR5000, which in fact is the same product, but they then marketed it differently. How long had you been aware of the Celotex insulation product?
It's difficult to put a time on it.
Did you know what type of insulation it was?
Well, I knew it was PIR foam, which is polyisocyanurate or polyurethane foam.
Did you
Because,
know?
I mean, these foam products have been around for a long while.
Did you know
I
it's
referred to you yesterday.
Sorry.
They would be used in insulation to fast food factories and the like.
Did you know its reaction to fire performance?
No, I didn't.
Were you aware that there might be an issue about how a PIR insulation would perform in an external cladding system?
Yes, of course I was aware of that, but I wasn't aware they were using it here.
Now, in your witness statement, you said at paragraph 5.20 of your first statement that you do not remember seeing the data sheet.
That's right, because I didn't open the attachment.
So you just didn't open the attachment. That's what I just
No.
wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
So you didn't take any information away from that data sheet at all.
No.
Can you explain to us, with reference to your email and discussion of Class Naught, how Class Naught is relevant to insulation products in an external rain screen system?
It isn't really relevant. I mean, if you're looking at approved document B, what it says, and I summarise it, is that insulation must be of limited combustibility, and the external wall, finished outer surface, must be class 0.
If it isn't really relevant, why didn't you respond saying exactly that, saying, I'm sorry, Class Naught is not relevant to an insulation product and whether it should be on an external wall? It wouldn't be relevant whether you were following approved document B or the full fire test route, would it?
I didn't know at that time what insulation they were using. In fact, I didn't know until after the fire had taken place. But they were saying that if we've got a material that is class 0, we don't need cavity barriers, in effect. And I'm saying, oh, yes, you do.
I see. So you just took it at face value that it was a material with Class Naught and you responded to that narrow question?
Yes, I dealt with it in a narrow way. For the reasons I've given earlier, at this stage of the development of the building, I was not really fully engaged. In fact, I was not really engaged at all.
So again, my question is the same as before. Why didn't you immediately refer to paragraph 12.7 of ADB and explain that the insulation needed to be of limited combustibility if following that guidance?
Well, I think I've already answered that question.
Mr. Ashton, no, carry on.
Well, we weren't part of the design team. I mean, what are the obligations on somebody who's stopped working on a project to carry on as if nothing had happened?
Well, Mr. Ashton, that rather feeds into what I wanted to ask you,
Okay.
which is this. If you had regarded yourself as still part of the design team, would you have responded in a different way?
Yes, I would have probably spent more time looking at the drawings and literally looking at it in much more detail.
And the attachment, would you have opened the attachment?
I might have done, but, I wasn't part of the design team, and that was the way I felt my status was with regard to the project.
Yeah, I understand that. If you're asked a question on an ad hoc basis, so you're not part of the design team, but for commercial reasons you are willing to respond to questions, is there any reason why you shouldn't be expected to respond in a fully professional manner?
No, there isn't a reason why we shouldn't do it.
So you would expect to do that?
I would expect to do that, yes. That's a fair comment.
And would there be any difference between responding in a professional manner to an ad hoc question and responding in a professional manner as part of the design team?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to answer because if you're not part of the design team, you're not really obligated to give them any answer at all, which is something I said yesterday, I think. With the wisdom of hindsight, maybe I should have said to Studio E, look, I'm no longer part of the design team, please stop sending me technical queries.
Well, I do understand that, and I can see the force of what you say, that you could have responded by saying it's not part of my responsibility to answer these questions. But once you do agree to answer the questions, I'm just wondering whether there's any real difference between one's professional obligations as a member of the design team and one's professional obligations in answering questions on an ad hoc basis.
Probably not. Put in those terms, probably not.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, that's great.
Yeah, just a couple of follow-up questions on that. Had you been part of the design team, would you have advised that the installation needed to be of limited combustibility, do you think?
Or tested, yes, indeed.
That's a very simple, easy thing for you to advise, isn't it? It didn't require detailed research.
No.
You knew that, didn't you,
Yes,
at the time?
indeed.
So
Yeah.
It wasn't something that was going to take you a lot of extra time, was it, to go and research?
Not necessarily research, just tell them that it needed to be of limited combustibility or justified by test data. That's a sentence which I could have added, I agree.
Is it right that at this time you're still recording your time and assuming you're going to be billing for the work? Is that correct?
Not necessarily anticipating billing, but certainly recording my time. That's part of, you have to record what you spend your time on a timesheet. Everybody does that.
I think what Exova do, we'll look at this later, is they've still got some headroom in their stage DE fee, so it just gets added to that in the end, and you never reach the limit of that stage DE fee. Was that your understanding?
I think that's correct, yes.
Yeah. Did you ever, at any stage on the project, give any consideration to whether Celotex RS5000 was a suitable insulation product to be used on the tower?
No, because I didn't know it was being used.
Did it occur to you to, forget whether you opened the Celotex data sheet, to quickly look up the project, research it yourself, or even approach Celotex directly and find out what type of insulation it was?
No, I'm sorry, as I just said, I didn't know they were using Celotex on the building.
Do you agree that if a product is of limited combustibility, it will typically be marketed as such? So take rock wool, for example. Do you agree that normally that they'll expressly say in the marketing material, this is of limited combustibility?
Oh, yes, and I would expect them to say a bit more than that. It's suitable for use in high-rise buildings and so on. And what tests it had been tested under and so on. It would be quite a fairly comprehensive description. Because if you try and market a material as being of limited combustibility, people wouldn't understand it.
Yeah. In your second statement, at paragraph 2.3, you say that had it been suggested that the insulation was Celotex, you would have raised doubts about that. And you said something similar yesterday in oral evidence. You said, if I'd been told they were using Celotex, I would have said that it is not acceptable without test evidence that's suitable for use on the building. And I'm suggesting to you now that effectively you were told that they were using Celotex. You were sent the data sheet.
No, I mean, I think this is in the same sort of category as sending me a link to a Stage C report, but not asking me to look at it and comment on it.
Now, in your reply, just looking at it, you say a material which has a Class 0 rating is not necessarily non-combustible. Can you just help us, I know you touched on this yesterday, precisely what your understanding is of the meaning of Class 0?
I couldn't give you the precise definition in approved document B, but as I said earlier this morning, it was an artificial term composed by the DOE to ensure that plasterboard was not put at a commercial disadvantage because it had cardboard facings. That's the background to it. And so it's a sort of artificial definition, if you like. I mean, I'm not aware of any materials of limited combustibility other than non-combustible materials. Mineral wool.
Right.
It is probably the only material you can use with confidence in the sort of situation that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Unless you happen to have had your system tested and validated for use on high-rise buildings.
When you state there in the second line, some Class 0 products will burn when exposed to a fully developed fire, which Class 0 products were you meaning to refer to there?
I couldn't be specific. I mean, some will. If they're mineral wool, they will have a Class O rating, but it won't burn.
And you weren't aware at the time, were you, whether Celotex RS5000 was non-combustible or whether it was, in your words, a product which will burn when exposed to a fully developed fire?
I think I knew that Celotex was isocyanurate foam, which is not a non-combustible material.
Can I, just moving on within this email, 'cause there's a lot of detail in here, why do you ask whether there's a continuous cavity apart from around the column casings? Did you believe that such a cavity within the column casings would have been permissible?
I was just asking whether there was one or not.
And you weren't curious to see the full details of the drawing, so you could see more information about the cavities and whether they were continuous in certain locations?
No.
Would you agree that you're not in a position to provide comprehensive advice without full details of the cladding system and the design, and should not have sought to give that advice without having that?
No, I was answering a fairly simple question, and I felt able to answer that without being in full knowledge of what was going on. But the specific question was, do we need to have cavity barriers if the material we're using is a Class 0 rating? And the answer is you still do. Now, maybe I should have just stopped at that.
Did you not think there was an immediate need to correct Harley's interpretation that all they needed to be concerned about was whether or not it had Class 0?
I thought I did by this response.
You mention also that you say you need to prevent fire spread from one flat to the flat above. Where is that requirement taken from? What were you thinking of when you said that?
Approved document B.
And any particular part of it?
Well, it's the provision of cavity barriers that's in in section 13 of approved document B,
Yeah.
where you need them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to give a 2 or 3 page answer to every what I regarded as fairly minor technical questions.
Did you ever think about approaching other experts in Exova to help you when advising on these topics?
I didn't think I needed to.
I mean, this goes into my next question, which is, did you feel that you were appropriately qualified and had the right expertise to be advising on these issues?
Do you mean the totality of the issues that they raised, or just this particular one?
This particular string, so back to the RFI, and then being asked about the installation as class 0 and cavity barriers. Did you feel that you were appropriately qualified to give the right advice about?
Yes, I did feel suitably qualified.
Going back to your answer earlier, you said if I had been asked the specific question, is it okay to use Celotex RS5000, then I might have answered in a different way. Were you qualified and experienced to advise on the use of Celotex RS5000? If you'd been asked to advise on that specific product, would you have thought you were able to, or would you have referred it to other experts within Exova?
No, I think I would have been able to do it on my own.
Now, you're asking a question at the end. You're saying what isn't clear from the information to hand is whether or not there's a continuous cavity from top to bottom in any part of the cladding, irrespective of the type of insulation. You put a question mark at the end. Can you recall, we can't find any evidence of this, but did Mr. Crawford or Mr. Anketel-Jones ever get back to you regarding the extent of the external wall cavity as you requested?
No, I don't think they came back at all.
And you didn't think to chase for a response?
No, the last statement in there was intended to be helpful. Are there continuous cavities?
And you didn't think that you needed to clarify the position you'd posed in this email before letting this trail go cold?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's an appropriate moment, actually. I mean, there's a related topic coming, but I'd rather do that in
Probably
one
better
go.
to break now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Ashton, we'll have another break now.
Okay, thank you.
We'll come back at 25 to 12.
Okay.
So if you'd like to go with the usher, that would be good. And then please remember not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. I have to keep telling you that just in case you forget.
It's all right. I won't forget. Thank you.
I'm sure you won't. Thank you very much. Right, 25 to 12.
Thank you.
Right, would you ask Mr. Ashton to join us again, please? All right, Mr. Ashton, ready to carry on?
I am, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, just a couple of follow-up questions from this morning's evidence. At what point did you consider that your retainer, as per the fee proposal, had ended? You seem to be saying you'd entered a different stage and you weren't part of the design team and you didn't consider you were appointed anymore. At what point are you saying you thought that?
But I think when I became aware that Ryden had been appointed and they hadn't approached us to help them.
Isn't it quite common for fire engineers to stay client side, so to carry on advising your client, the TMO, despite the appointment of a design and build contractor? Doesn't that happen on some projects?
That's exactly what is happening on a project I'm currently working on. The client said, I want you to carry on, notwithstanding the fact that there has been a contractor appointed to do the job. That being the case, I would have expected some sort of indication from the client that he wanted us to carry on.
You didn't get any kind of indication that they didn't want you to carry on, did you?
Obviously. That's the obvious
carried-
inference you can draw from not being said. Don't,
And you
just
carried
carry
on. And you carried
Yeah.
on being
Yes.
receiving requests for advice.
Yeah.
Can I just look at your fee proposal for a moment? We'll come back to this again later. EXO 50474. I beg your pardon. Sorry, that's not the fee proposal. And I'll just get the... Sorry, it's EXO 50...
I'm sorry, before you go on, can I
Yeah.
just ask you to clarify? You you just said to Miss Grange, I'm looking at the transcript, she put it to you didn't get any kind of indication they didn't. I think she meant want you to continue.
Correct.
And you said, no, obviously that's the obvious inference you can draw from not being, and then there was some overspeaking.
Sorry, did I not
What
very clear?
inference? Well, that's what I wanted you just to
Yeah,
clarify.
I mean, if there had been no communication at all from the client, then it would have been reasonable to assume that they were happy for me to advise on an as and when basis.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I've got the reference now. TMO 100038885. So this is the fee proposal that we looked at of the 9th of May, where you set out your work for the TMO, and we know that that was accepted and you were told to proceed on that basis. Can we just look at page 5 within that? There's a section there headed changes to client or invoice details. It says there, if during the project you inform us of changes to the client or invoicing information, we'd be happy to make those changes. However, if there are changes to the client company, we would need to carry out a credit check, etc.
Right.
So you were never informed, were you, that there'd been any change to the client at any stage?
No.
So you understood your client throughout to be the TMO, is that
Indeed.
correct?
Yes.
Even when you were providing the ad hoc advice you were providing in 2014 and 2015?
Yes, I think I assumed that KTCMO was still the client.
Yeah. And once you knew that you were being asked for ad hoc advice in, say, September 14, that we were looking at this morning, did you think to go back to the TMO and raise your status, your contractual status with them?
No.
Just on another point, we looked at that drawing that you were sent. Can we go back to that? This is EXO 50710. This is the drawing you were sent by Mr. Crawford, and I want to go again to the top left-hand section and zoom in on that. Yeah.
Right.
And if you see the labels towards the bottom of that, there's a label with a little circle, H92125, and it says PPC aluminium composite, rain screen panel and framing system. Do you see that?
I see that now, yes.
And there's a line and a label, and you can see it's referring to the outer panel of the rain screen system, as distinct from the insulation that's sitting behind it. Do you see that?
I do.
So it's referring there to a composite, aluminium composite. Do you see that, TBC?
I also see TBC after that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, yesterday you said in evidence, I think this is around pages 76 and 77, that you weren't familiar with composite metal panels. So when you looked at this drawing, did it occur to you that that was something you ought to clarify and check if you weren't familiar with an aluminium composite? Was that not a trigger to find out more about that?
It might have been, but TBC means to be confirmed in...
Yeah.
It might have been an alternative material,
I see.
ultimately. But as I said earlier, I didn't look at these drawings in a huge amount of detail.
So, picking it back up in 2014, in the light of the advice we've just looked at that you gave, were you aware of the Building Control Alliance Technical Guidance Note 18, Use of Combustible Cladding Materials on Residential Buildings, Issue 0, that had been published in June 2014? Were you aware of that publication?
No, I wasn't.
Can we just bring that up so you can just see it? It's at CEL 403615. So this is the Building Control Alliance note. So do I take it that you didn't read this at the time of working on the Grenfell project?
No, I didn't.
Have you ever read this piece of guidance?
No, I haven't.
No. So you're not aware of the warnings that are contained within it about the use of combustible materials on residential buildings and the different routes to compliance that it's recommending when dealing with that?
No, but looking at it, it's sort of pretty similar guidance as to what is contained in other publications. I'm not quite sure why the BCA decided that they needed to reinforce that. Because I'm looking, as I say, just looking at it, I can't really see anything in there that adds any information to what was already in the marketplace.
I see. So just looking at a little bit more detail under key issues,
Yeah.
if we can go zoom in on the bottom of that page. It says there in the third paragraph, a surface spread of flame classification does not infer any resistance to combustibility. It is solely a measure of the spread of a flame across the surface. And then in the first bullet, it says thermosetting insulants, rigid polyurethane foam boards, do not meet the limited combustibility requirements of ADB, B2 table A7, and so should not be accepted as meeting ADB paragraph 12.7.
Yeah.
However, if they are included as part of a cladding system being tested to BR135 and BS8414, the complete assembly may ultimately prove to be acceptable. Do you see that?
I do, yes. That's more or less what I was saying earlier. Without referring to rigid polyurethane foam boards, I mean, any system can be justified by test to be suitable for use.
Yeah. Did you have any understanding around this time of the limited conditions in which Celotex RS5000 could be used within an external cladding system?
Not specifically, but I was aware that Celotex was not a non-combustible material.
I see. The data sheet can be found, let's have a look at it again, RYD 30s18155. We can blow that up, and I want to look in particular actually at page 3 and the top of page 3. So it says there, Celotex RS5000 is a premium performance solution, is the first PIR board to successfully meet the performance criteria set out in BR135 for rain screen cladding systems. And then it says there, the system tested was as follows, and it explains what the system was. Can you see that it involved 12mm fibre cement panels? Do you see that?
I do.
So were you aware at any time when you were working on the Grenfell project that if you're using Celotex RS5000, it would have to be within the parameters of this system that was tested?
No, I think as a general comment, if you've had a particular construction tested to BS 8414 and you then want to vary that specification slightly, at the time you were able to go and get an assessment from the test house that conducted the test.
A desktop.
Say, look, this is slightly different. We're using a different facing material. We're not using fibre cement panels. We might be using, I don't know, sheet steel. Can you assess whether that would still perform in the same way as the tested system?
Yeah. Can I go back to the email you wrote to Mr. Crawford? This is EXO 401430. Did you think at this time to ask Mr. Crawford what type of rain screen cladding panel was proposed at this time?
No, I didn't.
Given it was clear that these email exchanges, that there was some confusion within the design team, did you think that it might be helpful to suggest a meeting to discuss these issues?
Yes, but equally, I would have, if it could have come from the other side. If there was some doubt as to whether or not what they were doing was acceptable, then it would be open to them to have called for a meeting.
And did you think about whether or not you ought to advise Mr. Crawford that the fire strategy report that you'd written in November 13, the third issue, should be revised, given that the B4 compliance was to be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue of this report?
No, I didn't think to tell him at that point.
And can you explain why?
No, I can't, really.
Now, in his oral evidence, Mr. Crawford said a number of things about discussions that he had with you at this time, and I want to take you to some of what he said so that you have the chance to respond to that.
Okay.
You've addressed this in your second statement, but I want to ask you some more questions about what Mr. Crawford said. Can we go to the transcript from day 9 at page 176? And I want to read from line 23. This is right at the bottom. I just want to read this. So he says, I think when I spoke with Exova, it must have been 17th or 18th September, and he's talking about 2014 here.
Right.
So the exact dates we were just talking about. To confirm what? Confirm the compliance of the Celotex insulation and the proposed cavity barrier strategy. My understanding from the conversation with Exova is that what was being proposed was compliant. I'm not sure if I entirely understood on which method they were using or which basis they assumed it to be compliant. I think I probably assumed a linear route, but I think, having said that, Exova have a massive wealth of knowledge in terms of similar projects, and they may have had the confidence to say what they said based on desktop studies, previous projects, similar projects, build-ups. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
So he is saying that he spoke with you around the 17th or 18th of September to confirm the compliance of the Celotex insulation. Now, I just want to ask you first, do you recall speaking with Mr. Crawford on the telephone at the time that these email exchanges were being sent and exchanged?
No, I don't recall any conversation with Neil Crawford.
So you didn't have any conversations with him
No.
around this time?
No.
Or in the days thereafter?
No. But it's interesting, he says conversation with Exova. He doesn't name me as the person that he spoke to.
It's pretty clear from his evidence that he's talking about you, Mr. Ashton.
Well, I didn't have this conversation with him.
So did you ever confirm the compliance of the Celotex insulation in conversations with him at this time?
No, definitely not.
Did you ever have a conversation with him in which you were talking about the Celotex RS5000 insulation?
No.
Can we look at another extract from his oral evidence?
Sorry to interrupt
Sorry.
you, Ms. Granger. If Mr. Crawford's right, it would be quite an important conversation, wouldn't it?
It would indeed, yes.
I'm just wondering, was it your practice to keep notes of these a conversation of that kind if it had taken place?
No, I wouldn't have kept notes, but given that it is an important subject, I would have expected him to confirm by email that I had agreed that these materials were acceptable. To rely on a telephone conversation or an alleged telephone conversation is not very reliable.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, yeah. Can we look at another extract from the transcript? This is at day 10 this time, at page 58. And I want to read from line 1 on this page down to line 1 of the next page. So the question is, so just so I've got your evidence clear on this, it's the Class 0 fire performance throughout the entire product, which to you meant that it was safe to use on buildings above 18 metres as an insulation product. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do, yes.
And then the answer that Mr. Crawford gives, no, it's the entire presentation material. I then sought to check that interpretation with Exova, which I did, and which I understood from what was fairly emphatic conversation from Exova, that it was applicable and that it could be used. And then there's let's look, and then he carries on with his answer. Their understanding of how it was and how it could be used may have been different from mine. They work on hundreds of buildings, they may have had knowledge of BR135 testing, for example, that led them to believe that it was applicable in this particular build-up. And then the question is put, but you don't know that, do you? And then he says, no, but what I know is from the conversations I had with Exova, they were emphatic, fairly emphatic, about the fact that it was appropriate to use, and that's what they suggested to me. I mean, that was my understanding from the conversations I had with them. I asked them to put it in writing. They put it in writing, the contacts with the cavity barriers. On reflection, it is a tacit approval in writing. But from the conversations I had with them, I understood that it was appropriate to use. Now, in the light of that, did you at any stage on the project discuss with Mr. Crawford whether the insulation was compliant and appropriate to use?
No, I didn't.
Did you provide emphatic confirmation to him that it was appropriate for the project?
No, I didn't. And it says in there that we wrote to them confirming this, and we did not.
Yes, I think it was clear from follow-up questions that Mr. Crawford was talking about the emails we've just been discussing, and then there's some further emails in 2015. He wasn't referring to any other written correspondence.
Yeah, but nothing in the emails that I exchanged with him could be described as emphatic about anything.
Yeah. And you don't recall ever putting in writing that the insulation categorically was appropriate to use?
No, and I wouldn't have done that anyway.
Were you ever asked by Studio E about BS 8414 system testing or BR 135 classification?
Not specifically, no.
And I now want to ask you about whether you had any discussions around the 17th, 18th September 2014 with Mr. Crawford about the ACM, the aluminium composite material panels. Can we look at what Mr. Crawford said about this on day 10 at page 91? And I want to pick it up at line 16 to line 11 on the next page. So the question is, but why didn't you say to Mr. Ashton, I should just tell you that the bits where it says zinc aren't right anymore, it's aluminium composite. And then he says, but I think I did. There was a follow-up. Zinc CM and ACM in performance terms, as I understood it, were the same. And then, so he worked on the assumption, I think, of the zinc CM performance, of which I think I had been the same as the ACM. Then at the end of the conversation, I think I did confirm with him that it was. My understanding was that we were running with ACM. And he's asked, when was that conversation, please? And he says, at the same time. And he's asked, at the same time as 17th, 18th conversation. question that you referred to on Thursday, that where you told us that he had said that the Celotex was compliant, the same conversation as that, is that what you're saying? And then he says, I think it was, yes, I think it was. Do you see that? And then he does say, the question is asked, really? And he says, I mean, maybe I've got conversations mixed up. Do you see all that?
I do.
And again, I want to give you the chance to respond to this. Did Mr. Crawford confirm that aluminium composite material was to be used? I mean, you pointed out on the drawing it was TBC, but did he ever actually confirm that to you on the telephone?
No, he didn't.
And do you ever recall at any time discussing the use of aluminium composite material panels with Mr. Crawford?
Never. I mean, I think in my witness statement I said I didn't know that ACM was being used until after I read about the fire in the press.
Did you ever specifically discuss the use of Rainabond 55 PE rain screen panels with Mr. Crawford?
No, I didn't.
And then I just want to look at what Mr. Crawford said later in the day, and this is within day 10, page 94, between lines 1 and 22. And then the question, well, we're going to look at the rest of the email chain shortly, but just so I understand your answer, you're saying, are you, that you had a telephone conversation with Mr. Ashton on 17th or 18th September in which he told you that Celotex RS5000 and Rainabond PE55 aluminium composite rain screen material, ACM, question, ACM, yeah, were compliant. Is that your evidence? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to summarise what I think you've been telling me, and if I'm wrong, please say. And then he says, my understanding is that in discussing the fire strategy, the cavity barrier strategy in relation to the wall build-up, he understood what the wall build-up was. We had sent him the insulation detail, the insulation data sheet, and he understood what the cavity barrier strategy was, and he understood what the cladding panel build-up was. And I asked him to confirm that in writing. And then you say that he did confirm it in writing, and then he confirmed it in writing that he thought that it was... So if I can go to the next page. Appropriate, but on reflection, it's more of a tacit approval than an explicit one. Did you ever confirm in conversations with Mr. Crawford that you understood what the wall build-up was?
No, I didn't.
Did you have a conversation about the suitability of the cavity barrier strategy at any time?
No.
Did you ever say to him that your advice was based on desktop studies or previous projects?
No.
And he goes on to say, I think I can just summarise this bit, that his understanding of the route to compliance on the cladding system was from conversations he had with you around 18th of September. Again, do you recall any conversations about the route to compliance for the cladding system?
No, I don't recall any discussion about that.
Did you tell Mr. Crawford around this time that you would be completing the outline fire safety strategy?
No, I didn't.
Mr. Crawford said that he remembered you alluding to the fact that he would have to complete the report or something of that nature. Do you recall ever having a conversation about having to complete the outline fire safety strategy?
No, I'm assuming that we're talking about one telephone conversation here, which I didn't take place as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
Seems to exchange a lot of information in one telephone conversation.
Conversely, did you ever tell him that you were so sure that what was being constructed was acceptable that there was no need for a further report?
Definitely not.
Did you ever tell him that there was no risk of external fire spread?
No.
Okay, before just sticking then with 2014 and moving on to a slightly different topic, can we go to SEA 30s12189? Now, these are some exchanges that you had in late 2014 with Mr. Crawford about observations that RBKC Building Control had made on the means of escape arrangements for the refurbishment. And if you look at the top email there, Mr. Crawford is saying that he's received some markups from building control on the fire strategy. He's due to meet them on Monday and wondered if you had any views on their comments.
Right.
And then in the second and third lines, he says this: on the Academy project, we had the situation where Tony Pearson managed to argue some of their comments away. If you had any observations, particularly where you think their comments may be excessive, I would be grateful to know, as I can take these with me to the meeting on Monday. Regards, Neil. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, was it your understanding that Tony Pearson had argued some building control comments away on the Calc project, the Academy and Leisure Centre project?
No, I think I took Neil Crawford's word for it that Tony Pearson had managed to do that. I didn't discuss it with Tony Pearson because the Academy building was Tony Pearson's job.
Did you know what topics he'd managed to argue away? Did you know the detail of what they were talking about?
No. I think my inference from this was that Tony Pearson has managed to persuade building control to accept a number of modifications. Do you think you could do the same?
Yeah.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, and what was your reaction to that? Did you think that?
Well, I didn't know what he wanted relaxations of at the time of reading that.
But did you think that it might be part of your role on the Grenfell project at this time to argue building control comments away, to go into debate with them?
Very definitely. I mean, we had quite lengthy discussions with Kensington and Chelsea Building Control.
Do you agree, though, that best practice would have been to engage in an open and transparent way with building control and not seek to get around issues that they're raising?
I'm not actually sure what Tony Pearson managed to argue away. I mean, our objective is not to take the line of least resistance on projects. It's to provide a safe building. Now, without seeing the context of what Tony Pearson and Kensington and Chelsea discussed, I couldn't comment further. It may have been totally unrelated to the sort of questions that we had.
Okay. So we're now going to go forward in the chronology and look at some emails that were exchanged in March 2015 between you and the design team on the project.
Right.
Just before we get to those, by March 2015, had you heard or read about a fire which had occurred on the Lacrosse building in Melbourne, Australia, in which a rain screen facade incorporating ACM panels had rapidly spread up the entire external facade to the top of a 21-storey building?
No, I wasn't aware of that specific job or building.
It was a fire that occurred in Melbourne.
Yeah, I mean, the fires do occur, but I don't follow them all.
No. Do you remember ever hearing or reading about that specific fire, the Lacrosse fire in Melbourne?
No, I don't.
It's not one you're aware of even to this day?
No.
No. So turning to the advice which was sought from you on the 3rd of March 2015 from Neil Crawford again, let's go to that. This is EXO 401315. And if we can blow up that top email. So he says, "Hi Terry, just a quick question relating to Grenfell Tower. As part of the reclad, we have added fire breaks around the apartments as per the email below. Can you comment on the level of protection, 90 plus 30, as to whether this is suitable? My only query might be that we have different levels of party wall at the lower levels, see attached fire plan with some 60, some 120 walls. Regards, Neil." Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Do you remember receiving this email?
Yes, I think I do, yes.
Did you ever respond to this email?
I'm not sure.
We can't find a response to this email.
No, it's possible that this was one that I identified in my first witness statement as one that I obviously received because it was on our system, but I may not have seen it. And had I seen it, I would have responded. I mean,
I see. Yeah.
looking at the project as a whole, I'm pretty sure that I answered every single query
Yeah.
that was put to me. Whether it was the right way to do it or not is another issue, but I don't remember responding to this, and as I understand it, I didn't, which must indicate to me that I hadn't read it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you talked about your witness statement. If we just look at that paragraph 5.25 of your first statement, this is at EXO, if we can go to this, EXO 401621 at page 17.
Right.
And you say there, this is in reference to this email, I do not have any recollection of seeing this email or the attached specification note or of sending any reply to it. I understand that in reviewing Exova's documents, no response to this email has been found. It's very possible I did not reply to it, and if that's the case, then I probably did not see this email. And that remains your evidence. Is that right?
That's in its essence what I just said. Yeah.
Did you have any kind of system or procedure within the office for checking or picking up on any requests that hadn't been answered, or would you just leave it to the person sending the email to send another one saying you haven't responded?
No, there isn't a system for checking on whether all emails received have been answered. But from time to time, if I or one of my colleagues fails to respond to an email, we generally get a reminder. May I please have a response to my email dated so-and-so, which is attached. And I didn't get that in this case.
Now, if we can go and look just down on this page at paragraph 5.27b of your statement.
Yeah.
You say, I would not have needed to look, sorry, let's pick it up at 5.27. I would not have needed to look at the details of the attachments to provide this answer. Having now received the email and the attachments, I note that at the back of the pack, there's reference to glazing P1 panels in the specification note, which provides some information on the panels and describes the cladding as aluminium composite panels. And then you say at B, in relation to that email and its attachments, I note, the specification note mentions that the cladding would be a Rainabond rain screen cassette. Rainabond is a brand name, and there are various types of Rainabond products, some which include insulation of limited combustibility and others which do not. The information provided in the specification note does not indicate which type of Rainabond system it was intended to use. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
I just wanted to ask you some questions about what you say there about the Rainabond product. What do you mean when you say here that there are some Rainabond products? It's the third line there of little b. There's some Rainabond products, some of which include insulation of limited combustibility and others which do not. What do you mean by that?
I think I'm not particularly familiar with Rainabond, but I think I must have looked at some technical data sheet for them subsequently. Bear in mind that this particular email was tabled at a meeting with our legal advisors, and as I've explained already, I hadn't seen it before and therefore didn't reply to it. But I can't say hand on heart now that Rainabond is a product which could be used in any circumstances without a test.
No. The phrase you've used there about the product, some of which include insulation of limited combustibility, do you mean include it within the panel itself?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
I see, inside the composite panel?
Yes, you have a sandwich of, I think it's aluminium, with a filling of one particular material or another. But I mean, this is only my understanding. I'm not saying categorically here that that is the case.
Yes, I just wanted to check whether you're mixing up the Rainabond ACM there with the insulation. But I think, is it right, what you're saying is that sometimes inside the panel you have insulation material of limited combustibility?
Yes.
Yes, I understand.
Indeed.
Now, you also say in your witness statement at little c below that had you seen these specification notes giving the specification details of the cladding, so had you looked at the attachments to this email, you would have drawn Studio E's attention to the fact that the use of styrofoam in the glazing panels would not have been accepted to building control because styrofoam is combustible. Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
Can you just explain the basis on which you would have given that advice?
Had I become aware of the totality of this specification, then I would have told them that it wasn't acceptable. Styrofoam was obviously a combustible material, in which case, there's no arguments about its fire performance. As I've said in B, it's possible that Rainabond has different fillers which may be acceptable.
Yes, I'm trying to concentrate for the moment on the glazing P1 panels having a 25mm styrofoam core. Yeah. Do you agree that the reason you would have given that advice to say, well, it just can't be used, is because of 12.7 of approved document B that provides that any insulation product, filler material, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility?
Yes, I do agree with that, yeah.
And you'd have said the styrofoam panels were classified as an insulation product?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Had you been asked, I appreciate your position is you weren't ever asked to advise on it, but had you been asked to advise on whether Rainabond aluminium composite material with a PE core used with Celotex RS 5000 insulation was compliant, what would you have said in terms of compliance with the building regulations?
Well, I would have said on the face of it, it doesn't comply, but I will make some inquiries as to the fire properties of what is proposed.
Let's just break that down and think about the aluminium composite material panel on the exterior for a moment.
Okay.
Can you be more specific as to on what basis you'd said it wouldn't comply?
No, I said sorry, you want me to deal with it component by component?
I'm now asking
I didn't know enough about Rainabond to say one way or the other.
I see. Would you have been looking, do you know whether you would have been looking at paragraph 12.6 of approved document B and diagram 40, or would you have been thinking more about 12.7 and the requirement for limited combustibility?
Well, I'd have been looking at the fire properties of the material in their totality. Because as I said yesterday, Class O materials, the approved document B does allow the external covering of buildings to be a Class 0 fire performance. That doesn't tell the whole story.
Right.
And with a material like this, you would have to look at it a bit more carefully to see whether, in fact, it was a suitable material.
Yeah, I see.
And for that, I might rely on our testing colleagues in Warrington.
Okay. Now, we know that on the 27th of March 2015, Mr. Crawford then sends an email to Mr. John Hoban copying you in. Let's look at that. This is at EXO 401434. And I want to pick this up on page 4, and the second email down on page 4, from Neil Crawford to you. Yes. So there we see at 10:53, Mr. Crawford states, there's been a lot of conversation on site about the cavity fire barrier requirements to be fitted between the existing concrete external wall panels and the new external rain screen aluminium cassettes. Can you please see the proposal by the cladding contractor below and confirm if this is acceptable to you? Do you see that?
Yes,
and
I do.
So that's from Mr. Crawford to Mr. Hoban, copying you in, and also copying in Paul Hanson of RBKC Building Control. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And can we just note while we're looking at this that it says there's been a lot of conversation on site about, and then in the second line it says to be fitted between the existing concrete external wall panels and the new external rain screen aluminium cassettes. Do you see that?
Yep, I do.
So you would have been aware, looking at that email, that at that stage at least they were using rain screen aluminium cassettes. Do you see that? And then the proposal is from Ricky Kay at Siderise. Below that, if we can look at that email below, And Ricky K states, apologies for the delay. Please find below an extract from approved document B of the building regulations. And then if we can go on the next page, he says, here you can see that it clearly states that 30 minutes fire integrity and 15 minutes insulation is all that's required from a cavity fire barrier. This is reference to rain screen cladding applications where the cavity barrier is deemed to be on the outside of the building. Our RH 2590-30 will offer 90 minutes fire integrity and 30 minutes fire insulation, therefore exceeds minimum requirements. And he says 120-minute fire rating is generally the industry standard for curtain wall to concrete slab edge fire stopping, where the fire stop is located on the inside of a building and is contained and considered to be a continuation of the floor slab. And then he says, please get in touch if you need anything further. Do you see that?
Yes, indeed.
Now, looking at those emails, was this the first interaction that you'd had with RBKC Building Control about the cladding system? Or the first time you've been looped in to an email about the cladding, which also involves RBKC Building Control?
I believe it was. Well, you know, I can't say with certainty that I'd never seen anything else, but I do remember seeing this, I think.
Did the reference to rain screen aluminium cassettes in Mr. Crawford's email to you, which we just looked at, raise any concerns with you?
It didn't register, if I'm honest. I don't understand the term aluminium cassettes. I mean, when I looked briefly at the original details that Neil Crawford sent me, there were aluminium elements in there, and that didn't cause alarm because aluminium is used for things like louvers and what have you. But to this day, I don't understand the term cassettes.
Okay. Did it register with you when you received these emails that they weren't proposing to use zinc panels anymore, but aluminium panels?
No, it didn't register with me that that was the case.
And so it follows, does it, that it didn't signal to you that you needed to consider giving some detailed advice with regard to requirement B4 at this stage?
No, I think the main focus here was the cavity barriers again.
Now, we can see that you're then copied into an email of the 30th of March 2015 from Mr. Hoban. Let's look at that. This is EXO 50715. And I want to look at page 2 of that. Yes, so if we look at this email, so this is from Mr. Hoban, 30th of March, to a number of people, Cider Eyes, Harley, Ryden, and then you're there on the list as well.
Right.
So it's actually sent to you, this email.
Yes.
And at that stage, what John Hoban does is set out his interpretation of diagram 33. And he says that it's his interpretation that the detail between compartment floors was not a cavity barrier, but a fire stop, which needed to be of 120-minute standards. Do you see that? So in the substance of his email, he says 2 lines down, I'd advise you that it is my interpretation of diagram 33 of ADB that the detail between compartment floors and external cladding is not a cavity barrier. Therefore, it must be fire stopped to at least the standard of the existing compartment floor, 120 minutes. You see that there?
Yes, indeed.
And you're then sent an email from Neil Crawford at 12:05 on the 31st of March. If we go to the bottom of page 1 of this string. Yeah, if we look at the bottom page, so there, 12:05, 31st of March, Neil Crawford says to you, "Hi Terry, can you comment on the history of this item? Please see correspondence below, as it's not clear to me why this item is causing such a difference in interpretation." And then he says, "Can't see anything that seems to reference it in the fire strategy. Regards, Neil." Do you see that there?
Yes, indeed.
And then I'll ask you some questions about this, but let's look at your response first. In response, at the top of page 1, you say, Neil, so it's later that day, Neil, this isn't something that would necessarily form part of a fire safety strategy for a building. Therefore, it would not have been dealt with in the fire safety strategy drawings for this building. I agree with Ben Kay. I believe that a cavity barrier is all that's required in this application. Even if we were to agree with RBKC, it's difficult to see how a fire stop would stay in place in the event of a fire where external flaming occurred, as this would cause the zinc cladding to fail. Kind regards, Terry.
Right.
Do you see that there?
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Now, again, I just want to take this email in stages. First of all, why was this not something that would necessarily form part of a fire safety strategy for a building?
Well, I think that's not correct as written. I'm not quite sure why I wrote that. I mean, the provision of cavity barriers would normally be part of a fire safety strategy under B3. It would just say that internal voids will be provided with fire cavity barriers and so on. I think the main thrust of this was to do with whether or not there needed to be a fire stop or a cavity barrier at the junction between the cladding and the structural floors. And in that sense, I agree with Mr. Kay that quite clearly it was a cavity barrier and not a fire stop.
Yeah. So you knew that cavity barriers arose in the context of functional requirements B3 and B4. You knew that.
Absolutely.
And you knew that your fire strategy reports for the project had purported to address both of those requirements, hadn't they?
Hadn't.
Had. They dealt with B3 and B4.
Oh, yes. But not in great detail, I have to say that.
Isn't advice on cavity barriers something that a fire strategy consultant would need to address when considering the fire strategy for a building that was to be overclad?
Arguably, yes, it would be. I think it was an unfortunate form of words in the sense that you wouldn't be discussing in the body of a fire strategy whether or not there was a difference between a fire stop and a cavity barrier. That's what I meant.
Yeah. Do you think in that first statement, which you've just said was not strictly correct, that what you were really trying to do here was justify your failure to deal with it in the fire strategy reports that you prepared prior to this?
No, as I said just now, the central question here was, do we need a fire stop or a cavity barrier where the floor is at the junction of the floor and the external wall? And that sort of argument would not be part of a fire strategy. I certainly wouldn't have said, well, this wouldn't form part of a fire safety strategy because I'd forgotten to deal with it in the report.
Yeah.
That wasn't my intention at all.
Can we just look at what you said in your witness statement about this? This is at paragraph 5.29F. This is at EXO 401621 at page 19. So you say there, I replied that this isn't something that would necessarily form part of a fire safety strategy. Looking at this comment now, it reads a little oddly. I think that my comment was probably a narrow one, i.e. that a detailed commentary on whether approved document B required cavity barriers or fire stops in this location was not something which would normally be included in a fire safety strategy. In a broader sense, commenting on the need for cavity barriers within a cladding system or elsewhere certainly might form part of a fire safety strategy. I agreed, however, that a cavity barrier is all that's required in this application, and then you say how your email continued.
Yes, I think that's putting in slightly different wording what I've just said to you. That it was, you wouldn't have an argument in a fire strategy report about whether something was either a cavity barrier or a fire stop. You would actually have made it quite clear what was needed where.
When would commentary on whether ADB required cavity barriers or fire stops be included as part of a fire safety strategy?
It never.
Never.
That's what I'm suggesting, that
see.
by the time you've written the fire strategy, you would have advised the design team that you need cavity barriers here because it's only closing a cavity, or you need fire stops because this junction needs to have the same standard of fire resistance as the floor to which it forms a junction with a wall with.
I see. But I think you've accepted here, and I think you accepted earlier, that you've said in a broader sense, commenting on the need for cavity barriers within a cladding system or elsewhere certainly might form part of a fire safety strategy. You accept that?
I do accept that, yes.
And that's not something that you ever did in a fire safety strategy for Grenfell Tower,
In this
is it?
particular case, no, I didn't, no.
Do you accept, thinking back to the fee proposal document, which talked about compartmentation requirements, that it might be thought to be included in the work that you had committed to provide on the Grenfell project?
Yes, it could have been. But it would have been a general statement to the effect that you need to provide cavity barriers within cavities.
Yeah.
So to restrict the spread of the unseen spread of smoke and fire.
Yeah. And can you just help us a little bit more as to precisely why you thought the cavity barrier was all that was required rather than a fire stop?
Because of its location in the building envelope.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe that John Hoban was wrong in his interpretation. And I think you're probably going to ask me later on anyway, but fire stopping is designed to stay in place for the duration of the fire. It's an extension of the structural slab or an extension of the vertical compartment wall. Cavity barriers are only there to prevent unseen spread of smoke and flames. So they're not structural elements, they are elements to contain fire and smoke.
At this time, did you know what type of cavity barrier was proposed, i.e. whether it was going to be full fill or open state cavity barrier?
No.
Was that not something that you thought about clarifying with the team?
That would have been part of the consideration of the complete details of the cladding, which we never did.
Did you have any opinion on the ability of an open state cavity barrier to achieve 30 minutes integrity and 15 minutes insulation?
Well, they're used quite a lot. I mean, what you have is you have an intumescent seal, which still allows the passage of water, which has penetrated the outer layer, to drain down and be got rid of at the bottom. And then when there is a fire spread in that cavity, the material intumesces and forms a complete barrier. And it's the only practical way to do it.
But here it's forming a barrier against a metal panel that may warp or deform. Was that something you ever thought about?
We cover that later, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about it.
Yeah. Now, you refer to zinc cladding in the email that we just looked at.
Yes.
What made you think it was zinc at that stage?
I thought from start to finish that they were using zinc.
So I think we've just established that you'd received an email of the 27th of March where it was stated to be aluminium, but you just hadn't picked that up from the email, is that right?
If you're referring to the email we've just discussed where they were talking about aluminium cassettes, I didn't recognise a cassette as a complete cladding system.
Oh, I see. Yeah, let's go back to it. So it's EXO 50715 at the top of page 4. Sorry. No, that's the wrong reference. So it's EXO 50715. It's the top of page 1. Sorry, yeah. So that's where you say would cause the zinc cladding to fail. Did you ever appreciate at any time during your involvement with the project that the cladding had been changed from a zinc to an aluminium composite panel?
No. And I would have thought that somebody should have corrected me if that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Do you recall Mr. Crawford ever emailing you or calling you after this to tell you that the cladding was aluminium and not zinc?
No, I mean, we discussed this earlier when we were discussing his evidence. He'd never rang me.
Yeah. you refer in that email to Ben Kay in the second line. I think you mean Ricky Kay of Cider Rise. Is that right?
Yes, it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes, Mr. K. I said. I think.
Yeah.
But Ben in the email.
And now, as you've anticipated, I do want to focus on the last lines of that.
Right.
And by saying that the zinc cladding would fail, did you mean that the zinc cladding panels would burn, melt and fall off the building, and that's why a fire stop would not stay in place in the event of a fire?
No. Zinc cladding as an entity would not burn. Metal cladding wouldn't necessarily burn. I think the point I was trying to make here was that if you get a severe fire in one compartment or apartment, which causes the windows to break, if the windows are in some way connected to the cladding, there will be local failure of the cladding, i.e. it will fall off the building.
I see.
And it might fall off to the extent that fire coming out of the window would bypass the cavity barrier at the window head. And I think probably you're going to ask me about Tony Pearson's, because Tony Pearson put it rather better than I did, I think.
Yeah. I will ask you about that, but just picking up on that, that's a rather specific concern, flaming coming out of the window and localised failure. It doesn't seem to bear much relation to what you say here, which is where external flaming occurred, this would cause the zinc cladding to fail. It seems to be a more general point you're making. Could it have been a more general point?
No. I, based on the experience of fires over a large number of years, if you do get failure of glazing, if it's not in a masonry wall, it will take a bit of whatever it's attached to with it when it falls out. That's inevitable.
I see. If the cladding were to fail, as you've suggested here, wouldn't it follow that the external fire facade would have failed to resist the spread of fire over the walls in breach of the building regulations?
No, I think fail in this context means structurally. It means that bits of it would fall off the building. It doesn't mean that they would catch fire. And zinc, if it's pure zinc, you wouldn't expect fire to spread up it because it's non-combustible.
I see, and this maybe goes back to the fact that you weren't aware at this time of composite products, whether zinc composite or aluminium composite products that might have polymeric...
No, I wasn't aware of that.
In the middle?
No.
Does that not perhaps suggest that you weren't the best person to be advising on these issues at the time, and there might have been more appropriate experts within Exova that would have known, for example, about the development in the use of composite panels?
As I wasn't aware that those products existed at that time, I'm not sure that I can answer that. But in any other way than saying, well, no, I don't believe there was the expertise. We don't routinely call on our testing colleagues to give judgments on what's proposed on a material, on a building, unless we were unsure. But at no stage in this development was I aware that they were using a composite material, so there was no need for me to consult our testing colleagues.
Would you agree that the failure of the cladding in the event of a fire, in the way you've described in this email, would be a major fire safety issue for the project?
No. When I say it would fail, it wouldn't cause the cladding on the building as a whole to fall off. I mean, I don't want to go back years and years and years, but there was a serious fire in the West End of London where great big sheets of glass were released and flew along the street. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Bits of or pieces of the cladding falling, not the whole thing failing.
I see. But you said to us yesterday that you were aware, for example, of the big tower fires in Dubai. Weren't those kind of really quite stark examples of external fire spread through external rain screen panels?
But they weren't zinc, as far as I know.
I see. Were you aware at this time that the existing fire strategy report that had been drafted by Ms Cooney had justified the stay put or defend in place strategy remaining by reference to an assumed high degree of compartmentation?
I think that's a given for any apartment building. The stay put is because it's highly compartmented.
Did the knowledge that you had here that fire could spread, even if we go with your narrow, fire spreading from the compartment and out and localised spread, did that knowledge that fire could spread that way give you concern about its impact on compartmentation and your knowledge that a stay put strategy applied?
No, I mean, if I'd assumed, and I think I did, that the cladding and the insulation would comply with the recommendations of a food document B, then that would not have caused me any concern about external fire spread.
Did the knowledge that you had about this fire spread give you any concern, given the difficulties posed by the interior of Grenfell Tower, namely the ventilation issues you knew about at the time and a narrow single stair? Did that give you any concern? No,
my expectation of the internal compartmentation, that it was okay, or it should have been following the completion of the works. In terms of smoke control, my assumption again was that the design of the smoke control would prevent smoke spread into the stair. That's the functional requirement for a smoke extract system in that location. Now, if you lose compartmentation, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, if you lose compartmentation for one reason or another, then a stay-put strategy is a risky one.
Yes, but I'm not talking about the completion of the works, Mr Ashton. I appreciate you were... you knew that the smoke control system would be refurbished. I'm talking about Grenfell Tower as it existed at that point, and you knew that the smoke control system had real problems.
Yes, but I didn't know that there were any defects in compartmentation, and I'm not sure there were.
I see. Do we take it from the fact that Mr Pearson becomes involved, that you did have some concern about advising on this, or some concerns about ramifications of this?
No, absolutely not.
Can you help us as to how Mr Pearson becomes involved in this?
I think he must have been copied in on the email, and he offered his opinion as well.
Yeah.
I don't believe I asked him to agree with what I was saying, but I may have done.
Yeah.
We were in the same room together frequently.
Did you appreciate at the time that one conclusion to be drawn from your observations about failure of the cladding in the event of fire was that the proposed refurbishment works would have an adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread?
No, I didn't conclude that at all. If they'd put a compliant cladding on that building, then there wouldn't have been a problem, in my view.
I see. So it follows that you didn't appreciate that the comment you'd made in your fire safety reports that the proposed changes will have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread. You didn't appreciate that that comment required immediate retraction because it couldn't be justified.
No, I said it would be confirmed by an analysis in the future to deal with the information that I hadn't been provided with.
And you, I'm going to put it to you that what you should have done is that you should have retracted that comment in the fire safety reports and advised Studio E that they needed full and proper advice about the fire safety risks posed by the overcladding once you started advising in these kind of terms about zinc cladding failing, etc.
Nothing that I'd seen that I commented on gave me any cause for concern because I didn't know they were using unsuitable materials. As far as I was concerned, they were using zinc cladding, which I took to be non-combustible, and I think that's a reasonable assumption. I didn't know about the insulation, but I assumed that at some point they would tell me what it was, but they never did.
So you didn't think about engaging, for example, with RBKC Building Control in order to discuss with them whether the external wall was compliant with the functional requirements of the building regulations?
That's not something we would do routinely. We wouldn't ring up a building control department and say, is what we're proposing for this okay? It would be more direct than that. We would sit down with them with the details of what was proposed and go through them.
Did you consider that the statement you'd made in the in the fire strategy reports, the 3 issues, that the proposed changes would have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread, could still be justified?
It depends at what time you look at this. If you'd asked me if that remark was, or that statement was valid post the fire, I'd say no, it wasn't.
No,
but
I'm
at
asking
the time
you.
I wrote it, we didn't know what they were doing.
I'm asking you at the time you wrote this email here now in March 2015.
Yeah.
Do you think when you were writing it, or did you consider whether the statement you'd made previously could still be justified?
No, I didn't link the two because I didn't smell a rat. I mean, we were talking about zinc cladding and whether there needed to be cavity barriers or fire stops at the junction between the external walls and the floors.
Yeah.
It was that narrow.
And did it occur to you at this time that there might be a need to identify more clearly the performance requirements for the external wall construction in the locations where these cavity barriers were required?
I think I've already said that in evidence earlier that with the wisdom of hindsight, it might have been helpful to quote what the regulation required in effect in the strategy, but we didn't do it.
Yeah.
We assumed, I think, a degree of knowledge on the part of the reader.
Yeah. Can we just have a quick look at a passage in ADB? If we go to CLG 50224 at 86, page 86, CLG 50224. And it's a paragraph, 9.15 there, in the bottom half of that page on the left-hand column. It states there that cavity barriers should also be fixed so that their performance is unlikely to be made ineffective by, and then it says, C, failure in a fire of their fixings, and failure in a fire of any material or construction which they abut. Do you see that?
I
And
do,
then it gives
yes.
an example about a suspended ceiling over the top of a fire-resisting wall. Did you ever think about that guidance and have regard to that when you were giving this advice about cavity barriers?
No, I think the reality is that if what I said had occurred, you would get the cavity barrier would not have been an effective barrier against fire and smoke. With sort of collapse of the external covering of the building adjacent to that, it would almost become redundant, and I think that's pretty much in line with what Tony Pearson said in his response, which was only to me, as it happens.
Given what you've said about the risk of flaming exiting a compartment and spreading into the cladding, did you ever consider advising Studio E or Ryden of the need for cavity barriers around windows to prevent a breach of the compartment into the external cladding?
Not specifically, but I have said earlier today that there is some debate as to whether or not cavity barriers around window openings are strictly necessary where you've got cavity barriers at the junction of the compartment walls and floors. It is a matter that could be debated. I accept that the approved document says they should be provided, but I'm saying that it is a matter for debate.
If you had advised on that issue, would you have been advising that they were required around the windows?
If I'd been looking at the details in totality, then yes, I would have said this is what is required.
You talk about a debate in the industry. Were you aware that there was a debate in the industry at this time as to the correct interpretation of diagram 33, in particular whether in a rain screen cladding system there should be a cavity barrier or whether there should have been a fire stop, which was the same fire resistant as the compartment lines as the cladding passed over?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Ms Beryl Menzies, the inquiry's building control expert, has indicated that if she had been the building control officer at Grenfell, then she would have required a 120-minute fire stop at compartment lines to extend right through the compartmentation out into the rain screen system.
So she supported John Hoban in effect.
That's what she said, yes.
Well, that's an interpretation again, I would suggest.
Did you ever think about whether the substantive requirements of B3 and B4 together might mean that compartmentation should be maintained, and that this meant dividing the rain screen cavity with a 120-minute fire stop in the way that John Hoban and Ms Menzies has indicated?
No, because they, to my mind, go further than what the approved document says. If you look at where cavity barriers need to be provided, it's behind rain screen cladding.
Yeah.
It doesn't say you must have fire stops behind rain screen cladding.
Yeah. Now, moving on to that email from Dr. Tony Pearson that we just talked about, just 2 minutes after you sent your email to Mr. Crawford on the 31st of March 2015, you received an email from Dr. Pearson on this same point.
Yeah.
So can we go to that? That's EXO 401347. So this is just an email, an internal email, if you like, between you and Mr. Pearson that he sends to you. And he says, we note that the barrier against fire spread between floors is provided through the connection of the structural floors to the existing external walls. The existing external walls are expected to provide sufficient fire resistance to prevent fire from entering the cavities at or near floor or ceiling level. We would not rule out that fire could enter the cavity if there's flaming through the windows. However, if significant flames are ejected from the windows, this would lead to failure of the cladding system, with the external surface falling away and exposing the cavity, eliminating the potential for unseen fire spread. A standard cavity barrier should be sufficient to prevent fire spread between floors while there remains a cavity. In view of the above, we do not feel that there should be a need for a 2-hour rated fire break in the cavities along the lines of the compartment walls or floors. Do you see that?
I do, yes, and I said earlier that I thought he expressed it better than I did.
Yeah. You say in
He's saying the same
Sorry.
thing as me, effectively.
Well, let's just explore this. So you say, first of all, in your witness statement at paragraph 5.32, that you don't recall receiving the emails from Dr. Pearson at the time. Isn't it likely that you forwarded Mr. Crawford's email of the 31st of March to him and asked for his view on how to answer Mr. Crawford's query?
I think that's the most likely scenario, and I think that he responded to me too late, in other words, after I'd responded to Mr. Crawford.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Pearson has said in his witness statement that the likely reason he became involved in commenting was that all emails containing technical information had to be approved by at least 2 people. He says that at paragraph 4.5 of his witness statement. Now, we've covered this already, but would you agree, I think you agreed yesterday, that that was normally the practice with technical advice, even in email, that it would be approved by 2 people?
Yes, that was standard practice.
Now, by responding to Mr. Crawford's query at 13:32, before you've received Dr. Pearson's email at 13:34, do you agree that on this instance you didn't follow that practice?
Yes, I didn't follow that practice, but I was fairly confident in what I was saying to Mr. Crawford. And as it turned out, Tony Pearson was saying pretty much the same thing.
Did you read Dr. Pearson's email?
Subsequently, yes, I did, yes.
When you say subsequently, when would that have been?
Well, I think when I was having a meeting with my legal advisors. Our legal advisors, sorry.
Do you have a recollection of reading it at around the time you sent your email or shortly thereafter?
I think I may have done, but I can't honestly say one way or the other.
Now,
But it didn't give me any cause for alarm, because it essentially says what I said in my email.
Well, I want to put it to you that actually what Dr. Pearson's done is draw more explicit attention to the risks posed by fire to the cladding by explaining in particular that if significant flames are ejected from the windows, this would lead to failure of the cladding system, with the external surface falling away and exposing the cavity. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that, and I did say earlier I thought his response was better than mine. But,
Do you agree it's more explicit about the risks that are posed?
No, I think it's not the risks. I think what he's saying is what would happen in the same way that I was. If you get fire coming out of a window, it could lead to failure of the cladding system surrounding that window opening.
Did it alarm you that flaming through the windows might lead to failure of the cladding system?
No, I'm suggesting that would happen anyway.
Would you agree that if you were reading Dr. Pearson's email at the time, that you should have appreciated that his comments had significant implications for the fire safety of the refurbishment works?
No, I think I've answered that question in a different way earlier. Nothing that I'd seen to that point gave me any cause to think that there would be extensive external fire spread.
Would you agree that that had significant implications for compliance with the requirements of the building regulations, and particularly the B41 requirement?
No. As I say, I was not concerned at what was being proposed at that time, as I understood it. The question was, and I take you back to that, the question was, do we need cavity barriers or do we need fire stops in this location? And that's all it was about, really. And I sought to justify why cavity barriers would be adequate.
Yes, I think what I'm suggesting to you is that although it began with that narrow question, in answering that question, something far more serious was exposed by the answers that you're both giving.
Sorry, this happened. I won't say it happens every day. That would be an exaggeration. But on numerous fires, windows do fail, and if they're in a lightweight construction, they will cause part of that lightweight construction surrounding them to fail. That doesn't imply something far worse, which is the whole of the facade on fire, which is what happened at Grenfell.
Yeah. Did it occur to you that Dr. Pearson's comments here had significant implications for the correctness of the statement in the fire safety reports, that the works would have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread?
No, it didn't.
Again, I'm going to ask you, and I know what your answer will be, but I'm going to nevertheless ask it. Can you explain why you didn't seek to update your fire strategy report at this stage?
Because I hadn't got sufficient details from the architects to enable me to do that.
I see. So was it still in your mind that you might need to do that when you got those details?
Yes, absolutely.
I see. Can you explain why you didn't raise with Studio E at any stage that there was the potential for flame spread within the cladding system because the cavity barriers would not be effective once the panels started to heat up and melt?
No, well, to say that to a designer would imply that that always happens, and it doesn't always happen.
Just looking at Dr. Pearson's view, it appears to be that fire could enter the cavity if there's flaming through the windows, that cladding will then fail, therefore there's no unseen fire spread and no need for a 2-hour fire break. Would you agree, looking at that now, that it potentially overlooks the point that the cladding materials, including, for example, the insulation, can still burn and spread flame between flats even once the panels have fallen off?
I don't think that he envisaged combustible materials being used on the face of this building. I would differ with him in one respect, is if the fire comes out and hits the external surface of the cladding, it could be that fails first before it gets into the cavity. The other route, which I'm sure you all know about, is if the fire gets into the cavity behind the cladding. But that's not examined in this analysis of his.
No. Well, that's exactly the point, that it also overlooks that before the cavity actually falls off, there could be some unseen fire spread behind the panels.
There could be.
Yeah.
That you can't say that fire will never do what it's predicted to.
But doesn't that potentially present problems for the fire service if they are attempting to put out a fire and you've got unseen fire spread behind the panels?
Yeah, that's why we have cavity barriers. I mean, one thing that, as I think I've said this several times over the last few days, that's why we have to be careful with buildings where they can't fight a fire externally.
Did you discuss this further with Dr. Pearson at the time or with anybody else within Exova?
No, I didn't, no.
Do you remember what you did with Dr. Pearson's email? Did it just stay in your inbox?
Just stayed in my inbox, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, if he'd said something totally different to what I'd said, then I would have had a discussion with him and I might have gone back to Studio E and said, oh, my colleague doesn't agree with me, this is what we jointly think. But reading what Tony has written here, it's saying, as I said, slightly better than I would have done, but more or less saying the same thing, that you will get localised failure of the cladding.
Wasn't Dr. Pearson's written advice intended to alert Studio E, Harley, Ryden and Building Control that there was a need to review the fire safety of the whole cladding system due to the risk that fire could enter the cavity if there was flaming through the windows?
But this was an internal email from him to me. It wasn't addressed to anybody else.
Yes, but, I mean, we will ask Dr. Pearson about this, but did you not think about whether what he was doing was giving you some thoughts which actually were important to send on to Studio E, Harley, Ryden and Building Control so that they were fully aware of the risks?
I'm not sure that he said anything extra that needed to be conveyed to Studio E, etc. He's saying the same thing as me, essentially. He's saying more, using more words, but what he's saying is that you will get some local failure of the cladding, which could lead to the fire bypassing the cavity barrier.
Yeah. Now, if we go back to the email of the 31st of March 2015, SEA 30013044, yeah, and if we look at the top of that page, at that email that he sent to you, where he's asked you to comment on the history of this item, we can see in the attachments that he sends a drawing, 1279 SEA 06110, typical bay. Do you see that there?
Yes, I see the reference, yeah.
Do you recall looking at that drawing at the time?
No, I don't believe I did.
Can we just have a look at it? So it's SEA 402499, and we will need the native version. Brilliant, thank you. And what I want to look is that section on the top right, that proposed section, typical bay, if we could zoom in as much as possible on that.
Right.
Now, this again indicates that there were cavity barriers at the head of the window only. Can you see that there? At the head of the window, we see it says ensure horizontal and vertical cavity barriers meet tightly under P10 435. And there's nothing there at the sill of the window.
Right.
Does it follow then from the fact that you didn't look at the drawing that that was not something that you noticed at the time or checked at the time?
No, that's right.
No. Now, finally, I'm just on my last couple of questions on this topic, and then we can break for lunch, if that's okay. Can you recall whether in March, April 2015 you had any telephone conversations with Mr. Crawford about the cavity barrier strategy, i.e. calls, not emails?
No, I don't believe I had any.
Did Mr. Crawford ever raise with you any concern that it was not possible to construct the rain screen cladding in accordance with the ADB guidance, in particular section 9 of ADB and paragraph 12.8?
No, I remembered a conversation like that.
Did he talk to you about the practical application of cavity barriers and whether it was possible to have them immediately around the windows or whether they should be further away but in line with the compartment walls?
No.
And did he ever talk to you about the practical application of diagram 33 of ADB within section 9?
No, he didn't.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, that would be a
Good
good
point.
moment for a break.
Yes, all right. Thank you very much. We're going to have another break now,
Okay.
Mr. Ashton.
Thank you.
Time for some lunch, so we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you.
And no talking about your evidence.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to the usher.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Up
Yeah.
to speed.
Yes, I think we're going to be fine. I mean, it slightly depends on whether we're inundated in the lunch break,
Of
but
course. Yes.
with any luck, we've covered a lot of questions overnight. So
All right. Well done. 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.